Hello, everyone. My name is Seungho Moon.
And I'm Charles Tocci. We're both at Loyola University, Chicago.
So we are recording this section on reflection on nonviolence pedagogy with Laozi and Deleuze in the era of pandemic. And Charlie, can you briefly share with the audience of, you invited this project with me, and can you briefly show your motivation to initiate the project?
Yeah. So we started this actually long before the pandemic. So it had its life went much before that, but it's gained new relevance and I think new perspectives through the pandemic and really through the political tumultuousness we've seen worldwide in the last several years. The project started with sort of a long running set of thoughts that I've had about the way that violence and nonviolence are presented in social studies and history curricula in the United States, and how these are really flattened and treated as just objects of study, but very remote, simple, flat characters within American history, and not really problems to be considered by students. I've thought quite a bit about what violence looks like in our curriculum and how our curricula just glosses it. Our histories are rife with violent actions, violent activities, violent peoples that are rarely given in-depth consideration about what it means, what that violence meant to people at the time, how it affected people, how it shaped events and experiences. And then related to that, what nonviolence looked like historically. We so rarely think about the history of nonviolence and really just center it in a couple of places in the curriculum. And so that called out to me for sort of a deeper rethinking. How can we try to reimagine nonviolence in a really thorough way so that it resisted the simplification and flatness that it's usually treated with? And so I think my original email to you, Seungho, was something like, "Well, what if nonviolence is not a thing?" I think that was the original concept or the original statement that started all of this off.
Yes, I really, fascinated by your thesis of nonviolence is not a thing, because I'm so familiar with some binary ways of thinking to say that, well, these are activities for violence, right? These are activities of nonviolence, of protest is nonviolence. And your thesis made me, it was like opening my take for grantedness about nonviolence. And also from my Eastern Asian epistemology, I was thinking, well, there is a yin and yang cosmology to challenge any binary ways of thinking of nonviolence and violence. And I proposed the idea of gerund format of non-violencing rather than violent act or nonviolent act. And it was a really fun project to have this cross-cultural conversation, how to look at this nonviolence pedagogy from very innovative way of doing that.
Yeah, I was really glad that you took that up. You took that invitation, because I think the project became much more rich when we were having the cross-cultural conversation and exploring different viewpoints. I think it would have been simple to take a sort of deconstruction approach and think about the violence inside of nonviolence and the nonviolence inside of violence, or to do some other very sort of Western analytical approach to it. But the project became much more lively and, to me, sort of went to unpredictable spaces because of the cross-cultural conversation, because you hopped on board. So right. I really appreciate it.
And actually, we live in the middle of pandemic. This is November 2021. And it was so timely to look at our non-violencing pedagogy within the context of pandemic. And when I look at this, the New Yorker cover page on April 5th, 2021, delayed by Kikuo Johnson, this cover reminded me of Japanese internment camps and Asian American and Pacific Islander struggles, how to make voice heard to claim that we are Americans, right? I am American, and the perpetual foreigner syndrome circulating within the AAPI, that also reminds me of what is the meaning of nonviolence amid the anti-Asian, all the violent acts in Georgia and on the street. And this is a personal note that I was walking on the street, in Chicago downtown, and I was yelled at Wuhan by a white person. And that kind of incident makes me wonder, wow, as an educator, what I can do to promote this nonviolence pedagogy amid a challenging time.
And the coincidence of the pandemic and the nationwide uprising for racial justice in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, really has come together to reframe how we imagine the role of violence in our society and culture, and I think pushes us to rethink what it means to be nonviolent, how to approach situations, to seek nonviolence, yet also seek to make change and resolution. This picture sort of is a standout picture in recent years that symbolizes, or it shows the sort of Black American tradition of nonviolence in the face of police oppression. It's a really powerful picture, and I think it's been seen widely. I think actually you pulled this first, Seungho. What did you see? Why did you pull this picture?
Oh, so actually, I was thinking during the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, there was guns and flower, the kind of stereotypical images about nonviolence. And I was wondering in 2000s and in 2010s and 2020s, during the time of the smartphone, what happens when smartphone becomes a really powerful tool to fight against social injustice and violence. And it was fascinating to see how Charlie and we prepare for images to talk about this nonviolence in pedagogy. And we presented this paper in 2018 at a Bergamo conference of JCT. And I thought about how our project has been evolved out of our current contemporary time. And at the time, Charlie, can you remind us of what this image was about? It was in Missouri, right?
Yes, and I don't actually remember the specific details. I would have to look it up again. I'm drawing a blank at this moment. I recall. This is from the Ferguson protests in Missouri.
Missouri, St. Louis.
Yeah, after Michael Brown. That's right. Yeah, and again, I think this, what strikes me here is the way that this calls upon imagery from the 1950s and 60s of Black Americans, peaceful and calm in the face of violent police response. You can see here the heavy riot gear that the police are wearing with zip ties right on their bodies to arrest a woman who's approaching them with, I think, just a smartphone in her hand, right? Just complete repose. It's just a really striking image of what we think of as kind of classical King Gandhi nonviolence. And in that same vein, one of the places that I've thought a lot about is in the US history curriculum, the ways that nonviolence almost always gets attached to only two figures. There's, one Gandhi, and Gandhi less so in the US history curriculum, more in the world history curriculum, and Gandhi's struggle against the British Empire. But then when it does show up in the US history curriculum, it's because it's an influence on King and sort of the classical high civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And here to the left is the attempted march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And you can see John Lewis there in the forefront in his light colored trench coat. And Lewis, of course, passed away earlier this year. And in so many ways, Lewis was the continued embodiment of that nonviolent civil rights movement, the Black nonviolent tradition that flows from King, his time, Lewis's time in the legislature and then Congress, continually advocating for voting rights and touring the country to motivate young people to follow on and become active in those same traditions. You know, these really sort of symbolize the two cornerstones of nonviolence in the American curriculum. But there's a much more complex history under the surface here. So in particular, this film clip, this small soundbite gets at one of the complexities behind King's thought.
So you prepare for this short video clip of how King talked about it.
The activities which have taken place in Birmingham over the last few days, to my mind, mark the nonviolent movement coming of age. This is the first time in the history of our struggle that we have been able literally to fill the jails. In a real sense, this is the fulfillment of a dream, for I've always felt that if we could fill the jails in our witness for freedom, it would be a magnificent expression of the determination of the Negro, and a marvelous way to lay the whole issue before the conscience of the local and national community.
Oh, you can pause there.
I think in a real sense.
Thanks. So when I first saw this clip, it really threw me for a loop. I struggled to think about how filling the jails could be a nonviolent act, how the people protesting could be subjected to the violence of arrest, of imprisonment, and all of the legal system, all the violence that the legal system applies, and that would be an expression, a tactic of nonviolence. And it made me go back and think about the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and maybe go back and think about other of the high civil rights movement tactics that, as King talks about here, sort of act as a call on the national conscience, that the nonviolent act is often used to provoke a violent reaction. Not always necessarily, but as at least anticipated, that they know that there'll be a violent pushback. They know that police officers will show up with dogs and fire hoses and pepper spray, that they know that there'll be the possibility of violence is always right there when using nonviolent tactics. And that just shifted my perspective and my thinking here about the relationship between violence and nonviolence, that it wasn't simple and that it wasn't just straightforward, but that there was a real dynamic there that that King and others involved in planning these events and thinking through the tactics had to really account for and try to imagine how their approach would shape and change a situation.
So actually, I was fascinated by the question of how can nonviolence be filling jails, and aligned with your question, I proposed the idea of how to theorize nonviolence in pedagogy from a very open-ended imaginative space, like Max and Green highlights us to look at things as if they could be otherwise. And in developing and designing nonviolence curriculum and pedagogy, what we are losing when we just set aside these binary approaches of, matching the columns for elementary school, for example, on the left side, there are some violent acts, and let students pick up what is violent acts, and also let students or people select what kind of actions are needed for nonviolence. And our purpose was, well, sometimes it works, but at the same time, what is some of the imaginary space that we can invent new approaches to nonviolence curriculum.
And then as I read further, another example that really jumped at me was the American nonviolent protests against World War II. And I think this one got at me because in American history curricula, again, we almost always think about World War II as a virtuous and just war, that while the United States was brought into it because of Pearl Harbor, that there is no question that that World War II was the just and right thing for the United States to do, to win that war, to defeat fascism, was necessary and was a heroic thing that this country did. And so it was really difficult for me to go back and see nonviolent protests against the war. How could anyone be against World War II? And with this, I was reading Kip Kosick's excellent book, Acts of Conscience, that explores the Christian nonviolent movement following World War I and into World War II. And in there, it sort of opened up how this movement, the nonviolent movement against joining World War II, was home to some of the mentored some of the folks who would later go on to become part of the civil rights movement, like Bayard Rustin starts his activism here in this movement. And this really, I think the key that pulled out of this book for me, out of Kosick's book for me, is the embrace of uncertainty. And that while the Christian nonviolence anti-war protesters were guided by real certainty in their principles that they were anti-war, anti-violence, there was real uncertainty about how to go about that work and what the ends of it were. And this case is one that I keep coming back to and that I've used in my own classes, and really sort of poses difficult questions for students. What would it have been like to be against involvement in World War II?
So Charlie, actually, this is my first time to see this image, and the center of this image, I can see a huge dollar sign. And do you have any background knowledge of during the protest why people put this, violence through financial, situations in the middle of this protest?
Yeah, because this picture comes from New York City before Pearl Harbor. So this is before the United States has a direct reason to go into war. And here, people are advocating against joining the war by pointing out the ways that the United States industry, through the Roosevelt administration, were profiting off of selling arms and other goods to allies, right? So that the fear before Pearl Harbor was that the United States would enter the war as pulled in by its allies, and that this would be one of the ways to end the Great Depression. Here, this is the way people are critiquing it, that the United States is fueling the war because it's trying to juice the economy and get out of the Depression.
Well, Charlie, actually, this image reminds me of, my Korean upbringing and, Japanese Pearl Harbor attack and U.S. involvement in the World War II. Actually, that made Japanese imperialism to give up their involvement with some colonization of Japan and other parts of Asia. And it happened August 15th, 1945. And then US get involved in Korean Peninsula, and Russia at the time, Soviet Union at the time, got involved in the northern part of Korean Peninsula. And this is a very historical within a transnational context, that US involvement in the war was not limited to some of the European countries, but it also influenced, the worldwide, particularly the Japanese imperialism from my upbringing. So this is such a fascinating anecdote. So, this is what we articulate in the article of the nonviolencing. Again, we try to avoid any dualistic approaches to that. So as Charlie mentioned, our thesis is nonviolence is not a thing, and nonviolence thing that we propose is we consider nonviolence in its gerund form to be a particular kind of activity performed to prevent violence in whatever relational patterns it may take. This open-ended space created by nonviolence facilitates imagining a fresh approach to human interactions and possibilities for education. As Charlie and we presented with the Ferguson, Missouri image, when I first watched that, I was imagining the conflict between fire and water. Fire is law enforcement. They put arms and all the fiery stuff, and this calm woman who is using social media as a way of protest. And I was able to connect these 5 elements in East Asian philosophy from wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And these 5 elements is all about relationship and the fluidity of how interact each other. So we utilize relational and contextual characters of water in particular. So in this paper, I brought the water image to theorize the meaning of fluidity and openness of nonviolence in pedagogy. Nonviolence adopts the fluidity and openness of water while resisting a fixed normalized approach to violence and nonviolence dichotomy. And we propose to investigate the socio-political standpoint of those whose benefits are highlighted, whose stances are recognized, and whose perspectives are normalized within a given society. And that's why we provided some of the images that we visualize this nonviolence in pedagogy. And also, I enjoyed drawing this image of yin and yang cosmology. And as you see, there is a yin element on the left side and there's a yang element on the right side. And you should find the small dots within to highlight the constant balances within yin and yang cosmology. We highlight constant movement and changes in yin and yang to construct the realities and practices of violence and nonviolence. So we avoid any fixed understanding of these are violent acts and these are nonviolent acts, but how we can look at the social political interwovenness of violent acts and nonviolent acts. And the movement of becoming illustrate the unpredictability of predictability as well as the predictability of unpredictability. And in yin and yang cosmology, again, it's all about movement and its interaction between the 2 elements.
Yeah, and because my background is in Deleuze and Guattari, and I try to draw as many concepts as I can from Deleuze because I find it so useful and so illuminating. My connection here was with becoming. So as Seungho pushed me to think about the dynamic aspects of this and the interrelations, I began to think of the concept of becoming, how everything is in action, in motion, and becoming something else. And this helped me reframe the thinking around the nonviolent resistance to World War II, and how that's a space of becoming as people advocate and push for non-involvement in the war. There's a basic uncertainty about what will happen, about what is actually happening in the world, what they know about the world, the activity, what's happening out in the broader space, how their actions will be taken, how their actions will influence things. That this is, it's at its core, it's uncertain, and it is in the process of becoming something else. And so under that broader frame of becoming, there were other Deleuzian concepts that I thought were really important to incorporate here to help deepen the thinking. One was haexiety, the idea that objects or events emerge from flow, that the thisness of it, the specificity, is something that grows out of the experience. It takes form through its own becoming. Minoritarianism, which is that politics work on a small and intimate scale, that we don't need to think about nonviolence or nonviolent protests, nonviolent resistance as having a universal and transcendental notion to them, that they can be specific and tied into a particular place and time. And finally, multiplicity, in that things are nominally unified, but they're all uniquely different. And so that that the nonviolence of one time, place, the one nonviolent efforts of one movement are not necessarily the same as others. There isn't, again, necessarily a transcendental connection between all of them, but they can all be differentiations and exist multiply within the same universe and become part of the same movement.
And actually, Charlie, whenever we present our theory on nonviolence in pedagogy, there is a constant question from the audience of, so how we can apply that to our classrooms and our daily practices. And I appreciate that you provide very specific and concrete examples of Joiner Institute. And can you tell us more about that?
Yes. So the Joiner Institute is at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and it is a center that studies war and its social consequences. It has a real investment in anti-war education. I think it was really interesting. It's the only center that I know of, a university-based center, that does this kind of work. And so I find it really interesting. And the scholars that have been involved there have studied violence and nonviolence and produced really interesting, different work than other places. The program itself does a variety of different activities. One that really struck my imagination was bringing war veterans into classrooms to meet with young people to answer their questions. I think that's important. So it sort of brings young people into sort of the experience of war and conflict and violence, and moves it out of the abstractions and moves it out of sort of the movies and the television and makes it immediate and makes it personal. And I think there's another event that another project that they have that reminds me of your work, Seungho, and that they have war veterans write poetry, and they publish that poetry, that artistic expression, as they try to communicate sort of the experience and the social consequences of wars.
Mm-hmm. So actually, they have their own webpage, and I got lots of help to retrieve their innovative pedagogical approaches of how to use, for example, veterans' uniforms, use the material to create something, and let students get explore the meaning of war. And hands-on experience makes the lesson very unique and outstanding. And I encourage the audience to go to the webpage of this Joiner Institute, and you will see useful resources that you can extend your inquiry on nonviolence in pedagogy, and as well as our theorization of nonviolence in pedagogy into practices. So this is our postulation of how to reimagine nonviolence curriculum. So we argue for a nonviolence in pedagogy as an imaginary and provocative place to embrace the unknowable, the unknown, and unknowingness as a potential launching point for exploring new approaches to education that involve examining familiar notions in different ways and transforming our taken for grantedness into ongoing inquiries.
And again, I tie back to Kosek in thinking about the openness to uncertainty is crucial for nonviolence. That uncertainty is related to visceral reactions about ethical issues that cannot be narrowed down to the use of a right and wrong dichotomy. There's always open space for non-dual perceptions, thoughts, actions about certainty and uncertainty. Mm-hmm. Here, Loy's work was really helpful for us.
Right. So actually, for me, to explore this uncertainty isn't an easy one, but we talked about the value of appreciating uncertainty in advancing our discourse on nonviolence in pedagogy. And we also talked about destabilizing isness. And the first chapter of Tao Teaching, the Taoist canon, talks about when you label Tao it's not Tao anymore, because Tao cannot be identifiable and they cannot be fixed within our humans concept. And we theorize non-violencing out of this isness. And Charlie, can you articulate what we try to say here? Because I propose the idea of, let's go back to Tao Te Ching and how we can destabilize isness of non-violence in pedagogy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate that. I appreciated that was a great push that we needed at the end to really reframe nonviolence so that it wasn't simply the content. It wasn't just simply a thing, and that thing was brought forward as content in the curriculum, but shifted it to become an open-ended problem, that nonviolence was a spot of uncertainty, both in the past, in that people who practiced nonviolence, Gandhi, Lewis, King, whomever that might be studied by students in the past, that these people were approaching an uncertain problem, that they sought to preempt violence, to limit violence in the future, to make social change, that they were going to employ nonviolent techniques to do that. But the how of that was always a problem. How to make that happen, how to do that nonviolent work was intimately tied up in the moment that they were in. And in turn, it should help our students think about how nonviolence in our present moment is also uncertain, is also an open-ended problem. And so sort of simplistic calls by a number of public figures to compare usually unfavorably nonviolent protesters in the present with nonviolent protesters in the past. People who say that, oh, well, King wouldn't have done it like this, or like the civil rights movement wasn't like this. To resist that. And while the past can be studied for the thought processes and the approaches that were used, the ways that nonviolent actors in the past approached the uncertain problem of their time, similarly, we can approach the uncertainty of our own present and try to approach this as a problem to be multiply solved and not simply a thing to be executed.
So we end up our talk by putting some of the questions to ponder about, in what ways does the educator's role change when the learning is focused on uncertainty and experimentation, and how might nonviolence in curriculum be represented or play out throughout art? That's the way we try to engage in lots of images representing nonviolence in curriculum. And also, how could this multimodal curriculum be transcultural to generate new ideas and perspectives? Again, our presentation is based on our published work. The title of the article is Nonviolencing, Colin, Imagining Nonviolence Pedagogy with Laozi and Deleuze. This is published through Journal of Philosophy of Education in 2020. So these are references that we briefly introduce. And thank you so much for your time today. And Charlie, do you want to have any ending remarks to our audience?
First, just thank you so much, Seungho, for your partnership and collaboration on this. To others, I would encourage them to seek out cross-cultural partners to do their work, to sort of explore it from multiple angles and make it much more rich and sophisticated, and also to approach the idea of nonviolence from new and imaginative angles. I think that's going to be vital for us in the future.
Okay, so thank you so much, and have a great day, and be safe and healthy amid the pandemic. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.